The first sign came at 3:42 in the morning, when most of the world was still asleep. A junior analyst named Kevin Holt was sitting alone in the monitoring room of Earth's Deep Space Relay Station, drinking cold coffee and watching data scroll across 3 screens. It was a quiet shift, like most shifts were. Kevin had been working this post for 2 years, and nothing interesting had ever happened. He had started to believe nothing interesting ever would. Then the signal hit every frequency at once. It was not like anything in the training manuals. It was not a natural pulse from a star or a leftover echo from some old satellite. It came from a single moving point just beyond the moon, and it was clearly, unmistakably designed by something with a mind. Kevin stared at his screen for about 4 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. Within an hour, Colonel Owen Drake was in the building. Owen was not a man who panicked easily. He had spent 23 years in the military, most of them in Space Command, and he had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do when something strange happens is gather information before you do anything else. He stood behind Kevin's chair, looked at the data, and asked a few calm questions. Then he made a series of calls that woke up a long chain of very important people in very different time zones. By sunrise, Dr. Laura Kent was on a plane. Laura was a language expert who had spent her career working on something most people considered either fascinating or pointless, depending on who you asked. She studied how communication might work between species that had never met. She had written papers about it, taught classes about it, and spent long evenings thinking through problems that had no real answers yet. Now, for the first time in her life, the problem was real. She arrived at the relay station with 2 bags and a look on her face that her colleagues later described as focused in a way that made them nervous. She sat down, put on a headset, and got to work. The signal was not simple. It was layered, like something built carefully by people who were not sure what kind of mind would receive it. There were patterns inside patterns, mathematical structures wrapped around something that seemed almost like rhythm, and underneath all of it, something that kept repeating in a way that felt urgent without being aggressive. Laura and her small team worked through the day and into the night, and through the next day after that. They slept in shifts on cots brought into the room. They argued quietly about interpretations, and tried different approaches, and threw out wrong answers, and started over. 41 hours after the signal first arrived, Laura took off her headset, pressed both hands flat on the desk, and was still for a long moment. Then she read the message out loud to the room. "We are the Veil. We are dying. We have nowhere left to go. We found your world in the old maps. Please, we are asking." Nobody in the room said anything for a while. Commander Carl Briggs was the one who flew out to meet them. Carl was a shuttle pilot with a calm voice and steady hands, the kind of person you send first into a situation where you do not know what is waiting. He took a small crew of 4, flew the approach slowly and openly, and made sure his ship was broadcasting on the same frequencies the Veil had used, just so they would know he was listening. Even from a distance, it looked tired, like something that had been through a great deal, and was held together now mostly by effort and hope. Huge sections of the outer hull were patched with a pale foam material that had hardened into rough, uneven shapes. Where weapon systems should have been, there were only empty brackets and cut wiring. They had removed their own weapons and left the empty spaces visible. Carl looked at that detail for a long time before he said anything. "They want us to see that," he said quietly. "They took the weapons off, on purpose." He brought the shuttle in slowly, and the Veil opened an airlock without being asked. Inside, the ship was dim and warm and packed with people. Thermal imaging had already told them there were roughly 4,000 life signs on board, crammed into spaces built for far fewer. The Veil were tall and thin, with pale gray skin and large eyes that caught the low light and reflected it softly. Most of them stood back when Carl and his crew came through the airlock. They did not crowd forward. They watched, quietly, with an expression that Carl later said he could only describe as people who had been hoping for something for a very long time, and were afraid to believe it was actually happening. The elder came forward alone. She moved slowly, with the careful steps of someone who was not well, and she was clearly old, older than anyone Carl had ever seen, human or otherwise. Around her neck, she wore a small device that clicked and hummed when she spoke, and when it finished processing her words, it produced a flat but understandable English translation. She looked at Carl, and she said, "We did not come to take. We came because your species was the only one in range that the Kreth have not already broken." Carl did not know what the Kreth were yet. For now, he just looked at her and nodded, and said they were welcome to come aboard the shuttle if they needed medical attention, and that he had been asked to bring her to speak with people on the ground. She told him her name was Senny. Back on Earth, Owen Drake had spent the last 2 days on the phone with governments, agencies, military commanders, and scientists. He had answered the same questions hundreds of times. He had not slept more than a few hours. When the footage from Carl's shuttle came through, Senny standing at the airlock, thin and tired, looking at the human crew with those quiet, reflective eyes. Owen watched it once at his desk, with the door closed, and then he put it together with everything else and sent it up the chain. The United Nations Emergency Assembly opened its session 6 hours later. The debate went on for most of a day. There were arguments about risk, about resources, about the unknown, about history, about what saying yes might cost, and what saying no might mean. People spoke with passion from both sides, and nobody was entirely wrong, and nobody was entirely right. When the vote finally came through, it was not perfect. It was not unanimous, but it was final. Earth would hear the Veil out. Owen read the result into the communication relay himself, and sent it up to the Veil ship. He kept his voice steady and professional. On the ship, Senny was sitting in a low chair with her eyes closed when the message arrived. Someone translated it for her in a whisper. She opened her eyes. She had spent 3 months preparing her people for refusal. She had written the words she would say to them when it came. She had tried to think of a way to soften it. She had not written anything for yes. She sat forward and covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook, and the 4,000 people around her watched in silence. And then slowly, one by one, they understood, and the sound that moved through that tired and broken ship was something Carl Briggs, still docked at the airlock, would remember for the rest of his life. Nobody slept well in those first weeks. The Veil ship stayed in lunar orbit, watched carefully by satellites and defense stations that had quietly gone to a higher level of readiness the moment the signal first came in. The 4,000 Veil on board were given supplies, food that took some trial and error to get right, water, medical equipment passed through the airlock in careful exchanges. Earth was being generous. Earth was also being cautious. Those two things sat side by side without anyone saying it out loud. Dr. Laura Kent moved her work from the relay station to a small office on the orbital platform closest to the Veil ship. She spent her days in communication sessions with Sen and a small group of Veil who had some ability with the translation device. She spent her evenings studying alone, building her understanding of the Veil language, word by word, the way you build a wall, one piece at a time, slowly, until something solid starts to take shape. She liked Sen. That was the simple truth of it. The elder was patient and precise, and had a way of watching Laura work that felt less like being observed and more like being understood. When Laura made a mistake with a word or a phrase, Sen never made her feel foolish. she would simply wait, and then offer the correct version gently, like she was handing something fragile to someone she trusted. On the third day of formal talks, Nathan Cole arrived. Nathan was a senior envoy from the State Department, a tall, quiet man, with gray at his temples, and a reputation for never raising his voice, no matter how difficult a conversation got. He had negotiated trade agreements and ceasefire terms and border disputes across 4 continents. He had never negotiated with an alien species before, but he did not seem to find that particularly different in practice. He sat down across from Seni, folded his hands on the table, and asked her to tell him everything. Seni told him. The Veil were old, not old in the way a country or a culture is old, but old in the way a deep river is old, shaped by time into something slow and steady, and difficult to fully see all at once. They had spread across 7 worlds over thousands of years, not through conquest, but through patient movement, building communities that grew food and kept records and studied the sky. They were not fighters. They had never needed to be. The galaxy as they had known it was a quiet place. Then the Kreth came. Seni described them carefully, choosing each word with obvious intention, clearly trying to give an accurate picture without causing the kind of fear that makes people make bad decisions. But, even told calmly, the picture was bad. The Kreth were a machine civilization, or something close enough to it that the difference did not matter much in practice. They did not want land to live on. They did not want resources in any way the Veil could understand or negotiate around. They wanted space, empty, cleared, ready for their own vast infrastructure to fill. Everything already living in that space was in the way. The Kreth processed things that were in the way. They had been moving in a slow, steady arc across one arm of the galaxy for centuries. They were not fast, as these things go, but they were consistent, and they did not stop, and they did not turn aside. The Veil had tried to talk to them. They had tried signals, then direct contact, then every form of appeal and offer they could think of. None of it reached anything that responded. The Kreth did not negotiate any more than a river negotiates with a stone it is slowly covering. They simply moved, and the Veil worlds fell one by one over the span of a generation, and the people who survived gathered what they could carry and ran. Nathan listened to all of this without interrupting. When Sene finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked the question that every government on Earth was waiting for the answer to. "If we help you," he said, "does that bring the Kreth here faster? Are they coming because of you, or were they always coming?" Sene looked at him. She did not look away. She said that the Kreth's path would reach Earth in approximately 200 years, whether the Veil were here or not. The Veil's arrival might have made the trail slightly easier to follow, but they were not the reason. Earth was already in the arc. It had been in the arc before the Veil ever sent their signal. Then she said something that Nathan wrote down word for word and read back to himself several times that night. She said, "We cannot give you safety. We cannot promise you that helping us makes you safer. But we can give you 200 years of knowing what is coming instead of 200 years of not knowing. And we can give you everything we learned, everything we built, everything we understood about the Kreth before we lost our worlds. We came with empty hands, but they are not entirely empty." Nathan sat with that for a long time. Down on Earth, in a secure room in Colorado, Admiral Pete Larson was reading the reports his team had been quietly putting together since the moment the Veil ship appeared. He was a broad, plain-spoken man who had no patience for conclusions that were dressed up to look better than the facts behind them. The report his team handed him was not dressed up. It said clearly that humanity's current military capability was not built for a fight with the Kreth. The technology gap was significant. The numbers were not good. Larson read it all the way through twice. Then he turned to the last page and wrote something by hand in the margin, because he had always thought better with a pen than a keyboard. He wrote, "We were not ready for a lot of things before we became ready for them. Recommend we stop waiting and get started." He signed his name under it and sent the whole document back up the chain. 2 weeks later, Nathan Cole and Senny sat across from each other one final time. The document between them was long and careful and had been reviewed by legal teams on 6 continents. It was called the Sanctuary Accord. It said that Earth would accept the Veil as a protected people. It said humanity would help build them a place to live. It said that Earth stood as the guarantor of their safety for as long as the need existed. In return, the Veil would share everything, every star chart, every historical record, every piece of knowledge they had carried off their dying worlds in the last desperate years before the end. It was not a trade. Nathan had been clear about that in every session, and he was clear about it again now. It was not a transaction. You did not charge someone for a door when they were standing in the rain. But what the Veil brought with them was staggering. A library of the galaxy, accumulated over thousands of years, handed over freely by people who had lost almost everything, and still gave, without conditions. Senny pressed her hand to the page beside his signature in the Veil manner of agreement. Laura Kent, sitting at the back of the room as the official record keeper, looked down at her notes and then up at the two of them, and thought that she was watching something that would still be talked about a very long time from now, when everyone in this room was long gone. The first problem was simple. The Veil could not live on Earth. The gravity was a little too strong for their thin frames. The nitrogen in the air sat at the wrong level for their lungs. The light that came from the sun was just slightly outside the range that felt comfortable to their eyes. Not painful, but wrong in a way that built up over time, like a sound that is not quite loud enough to complain about, but never fully goes away. Earth was close. Earth was generous, but Earth's surface was not the right fit. Director Meg Colton looked at the list of biological requirements her team had put together and did not say it was impossible. She said it was an engineering problem. In her experience, engineering problems had solutions. You just had to be willing to sit with them long enough. Meg had run large construction projects for most of her career. Bridges, deep-sea platforms, orbital relay stations. She had a reputation for bringing things in on time and under budget, and for not accepting excuses from anyone, including herself. When the Veil Habitat Authority was created 2 months after the Sanctuary Accord was signed, she was the first and only name on the list for director. Nobody argued about it. Her team settled on the L4 Lagrange point, a stable spot in space that moved with Earth around the sun, always the same distance away, always in sunlight. It was a good location for something permanent, something that was meant to stay. The habitat they designed was the largest structure humanity had ever attempted to build. The numbers were hard to hold in your head all at once. The interior volume would be roughly the size of Rhode Island. It would have adjustable gravity plating, so the pull inside could be tuned lower than Earth standard. The lighting arrays would be calibrated to the exact spectrum the Veil found comfortable. The atmosphere inside would be carefully balanced and sealed, with a self-sustaining farming interior that pulled from both Veil agricultural methods and everything humanity had learned from decades of closed-loop life support on space stations. A young engineer named Dana Pierce designed the atmospheric systems. She was 26 years old and had finished her degree at MIT the previous spring. She had applied for the project on a long shot, not expecting to hear back, and had nearly fallen out of her chair when she got the call. She worked 18-hour days for the first 3 months, and barely noticed, because the problem in front of her was the most interesting thing she had ever been given to solve. Gary Flynn arrived on site with a crew of 400. Gary was a construction foreman who had spent 20 years building things in difficult places: deep water, high orbit, the Martian surface. He was not a scientist, and did not pretend to be. He was the kind of man who understood materials and tools and people, and who could look at a problem from the practical side, and find the path through it that the theoretical people sometimes missed. He had a loud laugh, and a habit of learning a few words of whatever language the people around him were speaking, because he felt it was rude not to try. Within his first month on the job, he had learned enough basic Veil words to run a safety briefing in their language. He got most of it wrong, technically. The Veil workers on site thought this was wonderful. It broke something open between them, some invisible wall that formality and uncertainty had built up. And after that, the site operated with a warmth that nobody had quite planned for, but everyone was grateful for. The Veil workers who were healthy enough to suit up were meticulous. They were patient in a way that Gary had never seen in any crew before, willing to spend an entire shift getting one joint absolutely perfect, rather than moving fast and correcting later. And they had techniques that human engineers had simply never developed. One method they used for bonding hull plating together, a way of laying the material in overlapping diagonal patterns with a specific curing process, was so effective that Dana Pierce studied it for a week, and then redesigned 3 major sections of the habitat frame around it. Construction time dropped by nearly a quarter. Back on Earth, not everyone was happy. There were protests outside government buildings in a dozen countries. People carried signs about money and priorities, and the danger of drawing the attention of whatever had destroyed the Veil's worlds. Some of it was fear, and some of it was genuine concern, and some of it was the ordinary human resistance to anything large and unfamiliar. Meg Colton was called before a congressional hearing that ran for most of a day. The questions were hard, and some of them were not entirely fair. She answered all of them in the same flat, even tone she used for everything. When a senator asked her why humanity should spend this kind of resource on a species they had known for less than a year, she looked at him steadily and said, "We signed an accord. We keep our word. That is the short answer. The longer answer is that in 200 years, when the Kreth come, regardless of what we do today, our grandchildren will be very glad we spent these 4 years learning from the people who survived them once." The hearing ended without resolution, as hearings often do. But the project did not stop. In the second year, Sene came to the construction site. She was brought up in a pressurized shuttle, wrapped in a support suit that helped carry some of her own weight. Her health had been getting worse slowly and steadily, in the way that old age works when it has finally decided it is finished being patient. But she had asked to see the site, and nobody was going to tell her no. Gary Flynn met her at the observation window. They stood side by side and looked out at the growing frame of the habitat, the long curved spars, the expanding grid of hull plating, the lights of 100 worker suits moving carefully across the structure like slow fireflies. Sen was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him, through the translation device, whether he was afraid. Not of the project, of what was coming, of the Kreth. Gary thought about it honestly before he answered, which was the only way he knew how to answer anything. He said yes, he was afraid of them fine. He just found that being afraid and being useful at the same time was something humans had always been fairly good at. It was not a cure for the fear. It just meant the fear did not get to make the decisions. Sene looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the window. She did not live to see the habitat finished. In the third year, quietly, she was gone. She had asked that her remains stay aboard the station until the interior was sealed and breathable, so that she could be home in whatever way was still possible. The Vial held a ceremony when that day came. Laura Kent stood at the back of the room, the only human present, and did not understand every word. She understood enough. When the habitat was finally declared complete and ready, 4011 vial crossed through the airlock into the place that had been built for them. Gary Flynn stood at the entrance and shook each one of them by the hand as they passed. It took him most of a day. He did not move from the spot. Nobody had expected them for another 170 years. That was what the projections said. That was what the models built from Veil star charts and Kreth movement patterns had told Earth's analysts, over and over, in report after report, for the past 3 decades. 170 years, give or take. Enough time to prepare. Enough time to build something worth standing behind. The projections were wrong. It was a young officer named Leon Webb who first got a clean reading on them. Leon was 24 years old and had been posted to the Deep Space Centra platform on the outer edge of the solar system for 6 months. It was a quiet posting mostly. Long shifts watching data move across screens, logging routine passes of rock and ice, and the occasional probe signal bouncing back from somewhere far away. Leon was good at his job in a careful, unhurried way. He did not jump to conclusions. He checked things twice before he said them out loud. He checked this one 3 times. Then he opened a direct channel to Admiral Dana Pierce and told her, in a voice that was steadier than he felt, that he had 11 contacts on the outer sensor grid, moving in formation, on a heading that pointed straight at the heart of the solar system. The contacts did not match any known human vessel. They did not match any natural object. But they did match, almost perfectly, the silhouette profiles the Veil had provided 30 years ago in the intelligence files they handed over with the Sanctuary Accord. The Kreth were here. Dana Pierce had not been an admiral for very long, as these things go. Most people who knew her still thought of her first as the young engineer who had designed the atmospheric systems for the Veil habitat. The one who had worked 18-hour days and solved problems that older people had told her were too hard. She had shifted into the defense side of things gradually, pulled by the quiet understanding that the habitat she had helped build would need more than walls to protect it. She had proven to be as good at strategy as she had been at engineering, which surprised some people and did not surprise the ones who had worked with her closely. She looked at Leon's data for a long moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not move quickly. She turned to her operations officer and said calmly and clearly, "Begin Accord Protocol 7. Everyone on the bridge knew what that meant. They had trained for it. They had run the drills more times than anyone wanted to count. But drills and real things are different in a way that no amount of training fully closes." And for a few seconds after Dana's words, the room was very still. Then people started moving, and the stillness was gone. Accord Protocol 7 activated the full solar defense perimeter, a layered system that had been 30 years in the building. Railgun platforms along the outer markers powered up. Drone swarm bays unlocked. Directed energy batteries came online at 17 stations between the outer edge of the system and the inner planets. The standing fleet, 12 warships and 22 support vessels, moved to their assigned positions with the quiet efficiency of people who had been ready for this for a long time and were relieved, in a strange way, that the waiting was finally over. On board the defense cruiser Steadfast Resolve, a Veil officer named Aaron was already at his post. Aaron was 31 years old, born inside the habitat, and had known no other home. He had grown up among humans and Veil in roughly equal measure, eating in both mess halls, speaking both languages without thinking about which one he was using, understanding both peoples in the particular way that only comes from growing up between two worlds rather than visiting one from the other. He had enlisted in the Joint Fleet 3 years ago, over the quiet concern of older Veil who were not sure it was the right path for any of them. He was currently serving as a liaison officer and translator, and when the alert came through, he felt something settle in his chest, that was not quite calm and not quite fear, but somewhere in the space between. The Kreth sent their message 40 minutes after Leon's first contact reading. It was automated, pre-recorded, delivered in a flat, toneless signal that Aaron translated with his hands pressing lightly on the desk in front of him to keep them steady. The message was not long. It said that the biological units, designated as Veal, were property of the Kreth reclamation process, and were to be surrendered immediately. It said that any species choosing to interfere would be classified as obstruction. It said that obstruction was processed accordingly. That was all. Dana Pierce read the translation twice. Then she recorded her response, personally, spoke it herself in plain English, and had Aaron attach a full Veil translation before it was sent. She also kept it short. She said, "The Veil are citizens of Earth's protectorate. They are home. You are standing at the border of protected space. Turn around." The Kreth did not turn around. They crossed the outer marker at a steady pace, moving in a tight formation that the tactical display showed in cool blue lines against the dark of the system map. Dana watched them come and gave her orders one at a time, without rushing, in the same even voice she used for everything. The drone swarms went first, fast, expendable, designed to test response patterns and force the Kreth formation to open up. They did their job. 3 of the 11 vessels broke formation slightly to deal with the drones, and those 3 were the ones that the railgun platforms focused on in the first exchange. 2 Kreth vessels went dark in the opening minutes. A third was badly damaged and fell out of formation. But the Kreth hit back hard. The relay station at the lunar marker took a direct strike that tore through 2 sections and killed 9 people instantly. A defense ship called the Fort Halstead took a hit amidships that cracked the hull and sent it spinning slowly out of its position until the crew managed to stabilize it. On the Steadfast Resolve, a power coupling overloaded 3 stations down from where Aaron was sitting, and the explosion sent Leon Webb off his chair and into the wall hard enough to break 2 ribs and open a cut above his eye that bled in a way that looked worse than it was. Aaron was at his side before the smoke had cleared. Leon looked up at him and said, in a slightly dazed voice, that he was fine. He was fine. Get back to your station. Aaron looked at him for 1 second to confirm this was true enough to act on. Then he went back to his station. The battle lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, 3 Kreth vessels were destroyed, and the remaining 8 had pulled back past the outer marker, and were holding there, not advancing and not retreating, in a way that felt like a calculation being made. Dana Pierce declared the perimeter held and ordered damage assessment across the fleet. She allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to sit down and close her eyes. Then she stood up and went back to work. In the medbay, Aaron sat beside Leon Webb's cot in the quiet that follows a fight, when the noise is over, and the size of what just happened starts to come in through the silence. Leon was staring at the ceiling, ribs wrapped, eye patched, looking like a man reorganizing something inside himself. After a while, Aaron said, "They will come back with more." Leon nodded slowly at the ceiling. "Yeah," he said, "so will we." Everyone had known they would. Leon had said it from his medbay cot, and Aaron had confirmed it, and Dana Pierce had built her entire strategy around it. The only question was when, and with how many. The answer, when it came 14 months after the first engagement, was more. More ships, tighter formation, a different approach angle that suggested they had spent the intervening time studying the defense layout carefully. They had not studied it carefully enough. Earth had spent those same 14 months doing what it had been doing for 30 years, only faster. Shipyards that had been running at steady production shifted to full capacity. New railgun platforms went up along the outer marker. The drone swarms were tripled in number, and given improved targeting systems, built partly from what the fleet had learned in the first fight, and partly from Veil intelligence files that had been sitting in the archive, waiting for exactly this kind of application. Dana Pierce had read every page of those files herself. She had made notes in the margins, in her small, dense handwriting. When the Kreth came the second time, they lost 4 ships in the first hour. The remaining vessels held their position for 2 days, probing the defense grid without committing fully, and then they pulled back. The third engagement came 4 years after that. It was the largest so far, and the hardest. Earth lost a destroyer, and took damage across 9 other vessels. 41 people died. The names were read aloud at a ceremony on the lunar platform that every crew member in the fleet attended through open comms, whether they were 10 minutes away or 10 hours. Dana Pierce stood at the front of the room on the platform and read each name herself, slowly, without rushing any of them. But the Kreth lost 7 ships in that fight. And when they pulled back this time, they went further than before. Down on Earth, in a quiet house in Oregon, a retired admiral sat in her living room and watched the footage of the third engagement's final hour. On a screen her husband had set up for her, because she had refused to watch it in real time, and worried everyone who knew her. She watched the Kreth formation break apart. She watched the defense grid hold. She sat back in her chair and said softly, to nobody in particular, "We are actually doing it." Her husband brought her a cup of tea and did not say anything, because he understood that some moments are best met with quiet. The years moved forward. Aaron moved with them. He was not young anymore. The fleet had been his whole adult life, and it had shaped him in the way that a long commitment shapes a person, leaving marks that are not always visible, but are always present. He had risen through the ranks steadily, not through ambition exactly, but through the kind of quiet competence that tends to get noticed, even when the person it belongs to is not trying to be noticed. He was a senior diplomatic figure now, a bridge between 2 peoples who had grown closer with every year and every shared hardship. He had also become something he had not expected to become, which was a symbol. He had not asked for it, and did not entirely know what to do with it. But he was the first generation of Vale born inside the habitat, and he had served in the Joint Fleet, and he had sat in the medbay next to a wounded human officer, and said the truest thing he knew, and people on both sides of the species line had decided that meant something. He accepted it as gracefully as he could. Leon Webb had gone on to command his own ship. The steadfast resolve had been his first posting, and it remained the posting he spoke about most when people asked him about his career. He and Aaron stayed in contact the way that people stay in contact when they have been through something together that neither of them talks about much with anyone else. They met in person a few times a year when their schedules allowed, and sat and ate and said a great deal without using many words. Commander Tina Ford's ship was called the Unbroken Line. It was the first vessel in the Joint Fleet with a fully integrated human and Vale crew, and the early months aboard were exactly as complicated as anyone who thought about it honestly would have expected. The sleep cycles did not match. The food was a constant negotiation. Vale humor was dry and patient and tended toward long setups, while the human crew's humor was faster and louder, and occasionally confused the Vale members considerably. There were small frictions and misunderstandings, and at least one incident involving a shared meal that both sides agreed never to speak of in formal settings. But Tina Ford was patient. She had not taken the posting because it was easy. She had taken it because she believed that the thing being built between these 2 peoples needed to be practiced as well as signed on paper, and that a ship crew spending months together in close quarters was one of the best ways she knew to practice it. By the end of the first patrol rotation, something had settled among them that was not yet a word in either language, but that everyone on board recognized when they felt it. It was something like belonging. It was something like trust that had been tested and had held. A historian named Dr. Carol Vance published her account of the Sanctuary Accord 40 years after Seni's fleet had first appeared in Earth's orbit. She called it the only answer, borrowing the phrase from a line in Laura Kent's personal notes. The line Laura had written after learning that 17 species had turned the veil away before humanity said yes. The book was thorough and careful, and written in plain language that did not dress the history up into something cleaner than it had been. It talked about the arguments and the protests and the congressional hearings and the fear. It talked about Gary Flynn shaking 4,000 hands. It talked about Sene standing at an observation window looking at the frame of a home being built for her people. It became required reading in schools on Earth and inside the habitat both. The Kreth went quiet after the fourth engagement. Not gone. The censor grid was clear on that, and nobody who understood the situation was foolish enough to call it over. They were out there, somewhere past the outer marker, doing whatever a civilization like that does when it has run into something it did not expect. Dana Pierce, retired now and consulted sometimes for her opinion, said she thought they were reassessing. She thought they had encountered something their models had not accounted for, a species that grew more capable the longer the fight went on, and that had chosen its cause not from fear, but from something they probably did not have a category for. She said she hoped they were taking their time with the reassessment. The final evening belonged to Aaron. He was very old now, in the way that veil age, slowly and then all at once, the years showing in the careful way he moved, rather than in his face. He was sitting in the observation garden of the habitat, in a curved seat near the transparent wall that looked out at the stars. And beside him was a small girl of about 8 years old, who had been brought to meet him by her grandfather. Her grandfather was the son of Gary Flynn, and he had brought her because he thought she should know. The girl looked at the stars for a while. Then she looked at Aaron. She had the direct, unfiltered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to soften her questions. She asked him what the humans were thinking back at the very beginning, when they said yes to a ship full of strangers who brought nothing but a hard future with them. Aaron was quiet for a moment. The observation garden was still. Outside the transparent wall, the stars did not move. He told her that he had asked that same question to Dr. Laura Kent once, near the end of Laura's life. He had asked her what people were thinking when they voted, when they signed, when they showed up to build something in the cold of space for people they barely knew. Laura had smiled at him, he said, and then she had told him that she was not entirely sure anyone had sat down and thought it through that carefully. The vote happened. People saw what needed doing, and then they rolled up their sleeves and did it, because that was what people seemed to do when it really mattered. Aaron had told her that was the most frightening thing he had ever heard. Laura had laughed and said yes, she supposed it probably was. The girl thought about this for a while. Then she turned back to the window and looked out at the dark, where the stars were steady and cold, and the guard that had stood for 40 years was still standing, and showed no sign of stopping.